Hey, I'm Dr. T, and welcome to my office. Today I'd like to talk about the history of science and talking about the history of science. When we look at the history of science, there's this very classic approach that we'll see in textbooks. The idea is that science starts with Aristotle and a handful of other Greeks, basically goes dormant for 1500, 2000 years, and then resurrects with the Renaissance and then the scientific revolution, and things start getting going full hardcore. That's skipping an awful lot of time and an awful lot of wear. There's a lot more of this Earth than simply Europe. So yeah, what's going on here? Well, one of the major things when looking at this is it's not wrong to look at Greece as a major contributor to what we understand as science. What the Greeks would have called natural philosophy, and really for most of human history, what we now call the sciences, were and really probably best described as natural philosophy. It's looking at the world, understanding how it works, but in a more philosophical approach. And more of a holistic, but also without tools such as the scientific method. Although that is one of those tools that will be in a later narrative that kind of grows a little bit differently. Now, Greece wasn't alone. Our oversimplified view overlooks really any civilization that had developed to the point where you could have individuals who did not need to be constantly subsistence farming, who could presumably were reasonably affluent, and either as a hobby or as an artisan start trying to work together and understand how the world worked. Some of these were very philosophical, idea-based, like Greece, and Greece was really hardcore in the ideal-based, thinking about it in the abstract. Most other cultures were a little bit more on the practical side. So we can look, China was a classic case. Definite a lot of inventions, a lot of development of technology, what we would call techne, or what the Greeks would call techne. A little bit less on high ideals, a little bit more on the practical side. And China is legendary for all the really cool stuff that they did that we now use that, you know, they had hundreds or thousands of years before the rest of the world did. Another important focus would be parts of India, specifically the Indus River Valley. Did a lot of great work with math, also with medicine. And then pooling really the three great societies together was the fourth next one, which would be the Islamic Caliphates during what in Europe would be the Dark Ages. So that 800s or so, we start seeing a lot of the Islamic world. That's where the money was, and follow the money, you find the science. And they were taking material from the Greeks, from the India, and then from China, and pooling that together, really trying to understand what was going on, developing new understandings, taking Indian numerals, which we call them Arabic numerals because the West, we learned them from the Islamic world, but in reality, the Islamic world got them from India. The idea of a 1 and a 0. The 0 is a huge invention. And taking that and pairing that with Greek geometry and creating what we now call algebra. So yeah, major improvement. This is all happening well before and during kind of that 1500, 2000 year just gap that our normal history happens. I shouldn't leave out the Americas. They got a little bit of a later start. So if you look at the civilizations when they become big, this is definitely later than that of the Old World. However, certain cities within the Americas are definitely top 10 on the planet at time for population. Absolutely huge. We're only now really starting to understand the developments that they had done within the sciences. Unfortunately, they weren't really directly connected due to, oceans in the way. And when finally they did, Old World met New World, bad things happened for the New World. I'll let you study history to look at that disaster. But yeah, so now we enter into the Renaissance. Europe's economy is coming back due to some rather interesting conflict that, once again, I'll leave to the historians. There had been more information about Islamic work coming into European society. And with this, we kick off the Renaissance and then move into the Enlightenment and the Scientific Revolution, which arguably is not a single point in time. The Scientific Revolution is taking place over a fairly wide period of time. It's a much more gradual evolution of how we understand technology. And at this point in history, Europe is one of the major economic powers of the world, and that's why we're seeing a lot of the science that, what we would call science, which was by this point they were calling science, is really kicking off in Europe because of, geopolitics and the economics of the area. China had some really interesting politics going on. But yeah, so at this point, we can then start kicking off the scientific revolution in Europe, which becomes kind of the dominant theme. And this is the narrative that globally we've tracked, because that's kind of the most recent narrative. But there is more of a narrative. It's not just Europe. It's not Greece and then Elizabethan England. We're not doing, there's a lot in between here that we tend to forget when we have the discussion of how science becomes science. So in the next video, I'm going to talk about a couple of disciplines of science and how they become them.